Hey, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 9, Day 8. Today's journal, I'd like you to tell me about your beliefs. Now, if you don't feel comfortable doing this journal, that's okay. The reason I'm asking you to do this journal is not because I care one way or the other specifically, more so that we're going to be talking about the issue of evolution that came up during this time period and creationism and all those things. And if you don't know what the difference is, basically the Big Bang Theory is that a big explosion happened and everything that we know was created, the universe, everything. One is that the Big Bang Theory or creationism happened and then everything evolved, a mix of both, or that some God created the heavens and the earth, whether you believe in a Christian God or something else, whatever. Does not matter to me, not pushing one way or the other, just asking you to kind of tell me what you think, mainly because we're going to talk about how specific the view actually used to be back in a different time period. Okay? All right. Now, today we're going to be talking about the tide of change, okay, and how things are changing our society, and what were some of the major issues leading up to the period before the Great Depression. Now, in day 7, we got to talk about speakeasies in your journal, but we're going to hit that now. I forgot to add that little bit of information there, and I want to make sure we go over it. When Prohibition was passed, it was passed during World War I, and the idea was to promote the, baking and sale and production of bread for the war effort and food specifically, and not wasting it on something like alcohol. And the use of alcohol decreased for a period of time. The problem was Prohibition was very much impossible to enforce because it banned the sale and distribution of alcohol. It did not ban the consumption necessarily. And so speakeasies were created. These were bars where liquor was served illegally. Okay, so it couldn't be sold or served. That kind of defeats the purpose. Bootlegging became very much rampant during this time, and bootlegging is smuggling liquor across the border or just stealing your own liquor. And pretty much, you need to understand Prohibition as alcohol is illegal. That's the easiest way to understand it. But the bigger problem here is that gangs began to form, and they fought for control of the liquor trade. Gangs such as Al Capone, Al Capone led a gang in New York, and it became this huge industry of corruption and crime and all these things. But here's the problem. You had people who were involved in the police force, people who were involved in every facet of life who were taking part in consuming alcohol, and that made it very hard to enforce the law in any kind of way. The big problem here is that they needed to try to wipe out crime, and so they thought Prohibition would, do some of that by, limiting the amount of alcohol consumed, so, people make better decisions. The problem is they created a whole new form of criminal because of Prohibition. Now, morality changed and morals changed during this time. We talked a little bit about that in day 7. In an effort to draw crowds, filmmakers in the early 20s included more sexually explicit content. Things that, guys, I mean, we're talking 20 years ago, they didn't even have really movies. Now, 20 years later, they've got people that are exposing themselves in some way on the film that is, just trying to draw a crowd. And I mean, I can only imagine people losing their stuff during this time over this. By 1922, filmmakers were forced to set up their own organization to censor movies, avoiding outside censorship, so that they kind of took care of it themselves. Dancing to unspeakable jazz aroused widespread criticism in the early 20s, so you had people who were upset over the way people were dancing, the music, etc. Dance halls even tried to make rules that couples must stay at least 6 inches apart to encourage less dancing in a quote-unquote sexual nature. And by 1929, cities and states had laws controlling dancing and dance halls, but most people easily avoided these laws. Now, one of the reasons behind this is fundamentalism. All right, and fundamentalism is a series of pamphlets that were formed that were called the Fundamentals, but they're based on the Bible itself from Christian faith. And what that means is that you follow these fundamental practices, okay, and that every biblical story was literally true, and that you should follow what the Bible says exactly in your everyday life. Now, one of the things that challenged fundamentalism was the Scopes trial. And what happens in 1923 through 24, fundamentalist legislatures had introduced laws banning the evolutionary theory being taught in school. This had formed with Charles Darwin in 1859 that humans and all other species developed over time from lower to more complex forms. So the idea that humans uh, evolved from monkeys or apes or whatever you want to say. And so many of these states had passed these anti-evolution laws. But what happens here is John T. Scopes, a biology teacher in Dayton, Ohio, he had read his class a description of Darwin's theory and was arrested for teaching this. All right. And the ACLU, or the American Civil Liberties Union, they said had already been promoting that this law violated the Constitution, that you had freedom of speech to say and do whatever you believe, whatever that may be. Clarence Darrow, the head of the ACLU, was the defense. William Jennings Bryan, if you remember all the way back to 1890s when he ran for president, was against the big businesses. He's going to be the prosecution. Bryan defended the law, but ultimately admitted that some stories in the Bible were figurative. So he's trying to defend fundamentalism. And because he did not agree with fundamentalism, he was ridiculed. And he's not going to make it much longer after these trials. He dealt with a lot of public pressure, and he passes away. The final verdict from the trial was that he was guilty and was forced to pay a $100 fine. But later, the case was thrown out by the Tennessee court, and the Supreme Court has since said that such laws like this law against law supporting fundamentalism was a violation of First Amendment rights. Now, nativism is very much on the rise during this time as well. So I want you to think about all the things we talked about in the last 2 days. All of this is going on in the 1920s. It's a very booming time for just controversy and crime and new businesses and all sorts of things. The KKK is growing again. During this time, by 1924, over 4.5 million members. They terrorized Catholic schools in Oregon, removed anti-Klan governors, pursued violators of prohibition, and targeted Jews in the Northeast and the West. One thing about many of these KKK members is they were fundamentalists. They supported the Christian faith, and that's one thing that a lot of people in modern times have kind of looked back to of Christians are judgmental and sometimes racist, etc. And that's a very overgeneralization. You've got to understand that during this time, there was a lot of just hostility towards African Americans and immigrants, for that matter. I mean, they were obviously attacking people that were not African American, but they pretty much tried to enforce the law and were very, what we would call in today's society, radical. There are also different types of social protests. Artists and writers had become disillusioned by their faith in men following World War I. And they wrote these batting satires, or they fled from their culture, such as T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, or F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which wrote of the youth of his times as the beautiful and the damned. And so, many of these people who are writing these stories are looking at, that men as a whole are going to fail. And when I say men, we just mean human society is going to fail, and that they have so much potential, but they're doomed. And that's going to kind of be the idea, because they see so much negativity in our culture and our country during this time, between crimes, the prosecuting someone for what they say. I mean, just people are a product of their time, the same as people that live in 2020 are a product of this time. You look at what's around you and you make observations. Now, in the election of 1928, and we've already talked about Herbert Hoover does win and become president, but he ran against Alfred Smith, and Herbert Hoover was a fiery campaigner. He was dull, but he was very polished, and he was popular among women voters. And obviously, women are going to start showing out more and more to the polls. Al Smith had been a part of Tammany Hall, and he was considered a quote-unquote wet candidate, meaning that he was an opponent of prohibition. All right, and he had been the New York governor, and all he had was an 8th grade education. However, Tammany Hall, like I said, they pushed candidates through, and they're one of the strongest political organizations during this time. They had pushed him into the state assembly, and he had gained respect of the progressives despite their hate for Tammany Hall. So, progressives were against, we go back to Thomas Nast and all these people who were progressive and were against Tammany Hall, but because he had done such a good job and proven himself, he was able to, kind of get the respect to be able to gain a nomination for president. The radio showed Hoover as polished and trusting, and Smith, with a New York accent, seemed uneducated and very brash. And so, one thing to note here, and we talk a lot about this in class. We don't get to talk about it as much otherwise, but how you sound and how you act as a president is very important, and when you're running as a candidate, because it matters to people who vote for you. The reality of it is, even in the 1920s, it's still somewhat of a popularity contest. People want to vote for somebody they feel like is intelligent and smart and going to do what's right for the country. They don't want to vote for somebody who sounds different than them, or sounds weird, or doesn't look the part. And that is kind of the same thing that holds true even here in the election of Herbert Hoover. So today's vocabulary is speakeasies, bootlegging, and Scopes trial. Please make sure you get these words down. If you have any problems, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.